Okay, we are up to Daniel Perek Hey. Before we actually start the Perek, I want to do a very brief, quick recap of where we ended up at the end of last week's shir, because I ended with a question. And the question I asked is essentially going to segue into today's class. More or less, we will answer it, but we'll answer it, I hope, at the end of the class. But so in the beginning of the source page for today, I did a quick review of the chronology as we kind of traced it out last week. It all starts with the fact that in the 45 years of Nebuchadnezzar that we have accounted for in Tanakh, historically, Nebuchadnezzar II is attributed to 43 years, so it's not that far off. The first year of Nebuchadnezzar, based on Yirmiyahu, is the fourth year of Yehoiakim. Yehoiakim is there are four kings at the end of the kings of Judah: Yehoachaz, Yehoiakim, Yehoiachin, and Tzidkiyahu. This goes back to the very beginning of Sefer Daniel that we discussed. And really, from a chronological perspective, only Yehoiakim and Tzidkiyahu are relevant because the other two reigned for only 3 months. But Nebuchadnezzar, the book of Daniel, opens with the exile of Yehoiachin. And in that exile, the first wave of exiles set by Nebuchadnezzar 11 years before the destruction of the temple, because Tzidkiyahu, the last king, reigns for 11 years. In that exile, Daniel comes to Babel together with his friends. So Daniel and his friends are coming to Babel in year 8 of Nebuchadnezzar, and the destruction takes place in the year 19 of Nebuchadnezzar, 11 years later. Which means that from the end of the destruction of the temple, or from the time that Daniel exiles to Babel to the time that the temple is destroyed, is 11 years. We don't know how old Daniel and his friends are when they come, but we know they're young because they're called young boys. And that first chapter that has them eating seeds instead of food, etc., they're young boys. So by the time the temple is destroyed, they could be kind of young teenagers or older teenagers, kind of in that role. By the time Daniel comes before the king in chapter 2 to describe the interpretation of the dream, he seems to be a little bit older, more of an adult age. But there are 26 years remaining post the destruction of the temple till the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And so the theory that we put forward is that all of these events in the first 4 chapters of Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel and his young boys and his young friends, chapters 2 through 4, which are one after the other, that's clear. Right. His first dream about the multi-metals in the statue, his second chapter 3, where he builds a response of a statue made out of gold, followed by, and throws Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah into the furnace. Followed by the tree vision, which is his second dream. All of these things, which are all there to teach Nebuchadnezzar faith and humility, seem to be either just prior to or more likely just after the destruction of the temple itself as a kind of response to the temple, which leaves us more or less 20 or so years post the destruction of the temple, post the remaining of the years of Nebuchadnezzar, where we have no information about Daniel. Daniel doesn't come back on the scene until year 1 of Belshazzar. So all the remaining years of Nebuchadnezzar and all the years of Evil Medudach, Daniel is simply not on the scene. Year 1 of Belshazzar is his vision about the rise of Persia and Greece in chapter 7 and 8. Year 3 of Belshazzar is our story, our chapter 5, which is the writing on the wall, the fall of Belshazzar we'll talk about. And then the remaining chapters, 6, 7, and 8, we covered 6, 9, and 10 through 12 are all the beginning of Persia, either the year 1 of Darius or year 1 of Cyrus. So more or less, Daniel operates in the early years of Nebuchadnezzar as a young boy post in the first couple of years, and then as a young man in the court of Nebuchadnezzar, most likely in the early years after the destruction. Then there's a gap of about 20 some odd years after the destruction, plus 23 years of Evil Medudach. So we're talking about something like 46 years, more or less, where Daniel simply is not there. And by the time Belshazzar and his feast in year 3, Belshazzar doesn't even know that Daniel exists. The queen mother or the queen, or somebody has to come and remind him about Daniel's existence. I will also remind you.
Daniel is called Belshazzar. Is that relevant?
Sorry, say that again.
Daniel is called Belshazzar.
So let's be very clear. We have to distinguish between Belshazzar and Baltshazzar. Daniel is called Baltshazzar, Bet Lamed Tet, Shin Aleph Tzadik Resh. The king is named Belshazzar without the Tet. They are two different names. Now, you can argue that they're based on the same deity. That's possible, because Daniel is named after a Babylonian deity by the king. That is possible. But Daniel and Belshazzar are not the same name.
It's like the T in Soloveitchik, as opposed to Soloveitchik.
I don't believe so. It's pronounced in the Hebrew, certainly Belshazzar. It could be that it's named after the same deity. Not my issue for now, but he's certainly not the same name. So I want to make that very clear.
Thank you.
But there is certainly, it is stated explicitly that he's named after a Babylonian deity, because he was named such by Nebuchadnezzar. Not surprising, but it's a different name. In all cases, I wanted to also reference this last verse of Daniel Parak Aleph, which when Nebuchadnezzar places Daniel into his service, the end of Parak Aleph, it says that Daniel remained there in the service of the kingdom Ad Shnat Achat LeKoresh HaMelech, until year 1 of Koresh. Meaning the beginning of the book already tells me that the chronology of Daniel is going to take us from these early years of Nebuchadnezzar until the early years of Persia, until Belshazzar falls and Cyrus takes over, or Darius and Cyrus are the last chapters of Daniel. So that's also significant for us in terms of his age, right? If we are looking at the sequence here of events, if he's a young boy, when he comes to let's say he's 10, I'm just going to throw out a number. We don't know how old he is, but let's assume for a moment he's 10. By the time we get to the end of the book, we're looking at 60 some odd years later, and he could be, or 70 years. It depends on how you count Darius and which Darius we're talking about. There's two different versions. Unless we're talking about 60 or 70 years later. So Daniel, by the end of the story, the chapters we're dealing with, is not only a grown man, he's much older. And the mystery, or the question that I raised at the end of the shir last week, was why is there this 50-year gap? Why does Daniel sort of end his operations, if you will, or his communication, until year 1 of Belshazzar, and suddenly Daniel has 2 chapters with a great vision that he describes, and then year 3 of Belshazzar, which is he's called into the service of Belshazzar to interpret the writing on the wall and the death of Belshazzar himself, and then the remaining chapters. So we have to explore this, and we will do so Bezrat Hashem as things progress. Okay, everybody with me? All right, if you are able to turn on your cameras, great. I love to see faces. If not, I get it, and I understand. And we are ready to move on. Okay, sorry for the abrupt comment about Belshazzar and Belshazzar, but I just wanted to clarify, at least in the Tanakh, they are spelled differently. It's an important distinction. We don't always see that. Okay, Daniel Parak Hey. This is where we're up to, and we only started it. We didn't actually read the parak last week, so we're going to read it today. Actually, let's do it from this. Does everybody have a copy of the source pages? Let me just do a quick recap. Repost to the source pages. Okay, that's the Hebrew text of the Aramaic, and then copy link. This is the link for the source page. Okay. Belshazzar HaMelech עשה משתה גדול ל1,000 שריו ולעומת 1,000 יין שתה. Belshazzar made a great feast, 1,000 of his lords, with wine to drink. Belshazzar ציווה בתם היין להביא כלי הזהב והכסף אשר הוציא נבוכדנצר אביו מן ההיכל אשר בירושלים. While he was drinking his wine, commanded to bring the gold and silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had removed from the temple of Yerushalayim. Somebody asked me before if the destruction of the temple is ever mentioned. Here is the most direct reference we have to other than the opening chapter, which is the exile of Yehoiachin, to the destruction of the temple. And from these vessels, they drank, consorts and concubines. They drank wine out of the vessels of the temple. They brought the gold vessels that were brought out of the temple. They drank out of them. So you have the silver vessels, you have the gold vessels. Shatu et hayayin, they drank the wine out of these vessels. So they're sitting there in this feast, drinking wine out of the klei mikdash, and v'shibchu et Elohei hazahav ve'hakesef hanachoshet habazel ha'etz ve'aven. And they were praising all of their various deities and gods: iron, wood, brass, stone, silver, gold. Right, the deities of old. Ba'b'sha'ah, that moment. Yetzu etzba'ot shel yad adam. Suddenly there appeared the fingers of a hand. V'katvu l'umat hanivreshet, and they began to write on the opposite the candlestick, al hasid shel kotel ha'echal shel melech. They began to inscribe, to write on the plaster of the king's wall. V'melech ro'eh pas yad asher kotevet. The king is looking at a hand, a disembodied hand, writing these words. You can imagine if you saw such a thing, you would be frightened. It's a pretty normal reaction. Belshazzar is certainly frightened. He was frightened. His countenance changed. He turned white. His knees began to shake. Began to knock each other. The king cried out to bring in all of the Chaldeans and the astrologers and the astronomers and the enchanters and whatever have you in the world of Bavel. He called out and he said, whoever will read and interpret this writing, I will clothe him in purple, in argaman, royal colors, and I will place a chain of gold around his neck. Remember Yosef? Pharaoh placed a gold chain around his neck when he appointed him to Mishnah Lamelech. And he will be third in line of the reign of the king. Yosef made it to the second, but all right. Belshazzar only offered the position number 3. They all came in. And if you remember the first dream Nebuchadnezzar had, where he couldn't remember the dream, or he pretended he couldn't remember the dream, and none of them could read, none of them could tell him the dream or its interpretation. So there's a similar phenomenon here. Not only can they not interpret the writing, they cannot read the writing. And one of the questions we will explore next week is why they could not read the writing. It's probably the biggest mystery in the story. Belshazzar was frightened. His countenance changed. His lords were perplexed. Till in walked the queen, Hamalka. Now, the first must split whether this is Belshazzar's wife, his mother, his grandmother, right? Unclear who this is. But the queen walks in, opposite the words of the kings and the lords. She storms into the banquet, and she says to the king, long live the king. Don't be frightened. You look terrible. Calm yourself. Right? There is such a person in your kingdom, in who resides the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, he found him wise, like the wisdom of God or the gods, depending on whether it's who it's referring to. And the king Nebuchadnezzar made him your grandfather, meaning your grandfather, had appointed him to be the head of all of his advisors. He had that ability, surpassing spirit of understanding of interpretation of dreams. To declare, to interpret riddles, and to solve mysteries. That's what Daniel could do. There's the reference to the lettering of Belshazzar's name. So call Belshazzar and let him interpret for you. So again, where is Belshazzar? Where is Daniel? Daniel, in the next two chapters, we'll see, is sitting in Elam or in Shushan. He's sitting in Persia. Again, how he got from Babel to Persia at that particular time, unclear. Aside Daniel, so he's called before the king. Daniel. Are you the Daniel of the captivity of Judah? I have to stop here at this phrase because it's the parallel here is striking. When Yosef is called before Paro, in the beginning of, actually, let me pull it up. In the beginning of all right, it's just taking a second to go. When Yosef is called before Paro, at the beginning of Parshat Miketz, Parshat Miketz is Perek. Anybody Kriya on the call? So you have this dream of Paro that ends up calling Yosef into his service. And there it says that the Sar HaMashkim, who has been restored to his post by Paro, comes to Paro 2 years after he had forgotten about Yosef. And he says, I remember now all my previous sins. Paro had been incensed at his officers and he put us in jail. And there in jail, we each had a dream, couldn't interpret the dream. Bisham itanu. This is now, he's describing Yosef. We met in jail, who interpreted his dreams and who gave him the access to the king. Bisham itanu. Nar ivri, eved l'sara tabachim. Oh, you know who was there with us in jail? Some Hebrew slave of the chief Sara Tabachim, the chief Sara Tabachim is like a chief executioner. And we told him the story, and he interpreted for us. And so they called Yosef from the pit. And the rest of the story, as I say, is history. But the fascinating description of Daniel as Asher mibnei galut Yudah is reminiscent of the fact that the Sar HaMashkim, when he finally remembered Paro, and he brought him back to his service, he had to describe him as an Eved, Ishivri, right? Eved l'sar tabachim. He had to describe him as a slave. He couldn't acknowledge that he had a position, that he's a human being, that he had a status, that he had a contribution to make. So too, Belshazzar is looking at Daniel, who served his grandfather, who was the chief advisor to Nebuchadnezzar. He said, oh, you're from the Judean exiles? You're the one that my grandfather brought out of Judah and brought here as an exile, as a slave? So I heard that you have the spirit of gods in you. And you have additional wisdom and surpassing. I've called in all of the enchanters and advisors to come before me. They should read and interpret this writing. And they're stunned. They can't do it. I heard about you, Belshazzar. that you are able to interpret and loose knots, interpret riddles. So if you can interpret this writing and tell me what it means, I'll give you all that I promised. Garments of royalty, a chain of gold upon your neck. I'll make you third in command of the kingdom. Never tells us who the second was. Shetzar was clearly the first. Never tells us who the second was, but he is offering the third position. Okay. So Daniel answered. Now, I asked the question last week. Do you remember think back to all the conversations between Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar, and the style in which he spoke to Nebuchadnezzar, the atmosphere of the conversations between them. And they spoke about very harsh things. But I want us to keep in the back of our minds, not just the content, but the style, the level of communication between Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. We skipped over Avum Radach. We're now talking to generation 3, Daniel to Belshazzar. What does he say to him? You can keep your gifts and give them to somebody else. I'll be happy to read the text, and I'll be happy to interpret it for you. You, O king, El ha'elyon natan malchut gdula v'ikar ve'adar leNebuchadnezzar avicha. God on high, most high, gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father or your grandfather, kingdom and greatness and glory and majesty. Mina gdula asher natan lo, and of that greatness, kol ha'amim ha'umot v'halishonot hayu ze'im v'yerim mipanav. All of the nations and languages trembled before Nebuchadnezzar. Trembled before God. In other words, he gave him all of these powers and all of these nations, and they trembled before him. Before Nebuchadnezzar, I think, is a reference here. But describing God, Asher haya chafetz, haya memit, Asher haya chafetz. No, actually, this is still talking about Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had the power of life and death. Asher haya chafetz, haya memit, Asher haya chafetz, haya mechayeh, Asher haya chafetz, haya merim, Asher haya chafetz, haya mashpil. Nebuchadnezzar could rise to positions of power, lower people into the grave. He could kill. He could with a wave of his scepter. When his heart was arrogant and his spirit hardened, so he was removed from that throne. If you remember the story back of the tree in chapter 4. And deposed him from his throne and took his conscious awareness away from him. He was driven from civilization. His heart was like a man of the beasts. His dwelling was with the wild asses. And his body was wet with the dew of the heaven. He would bathe in the dew. So finally he learned that God rules over the kingdom of man. And he will set whoever he chooses over the kingdom. That was all a quick review of chapter 4. You, his son, Belshazzar, you have not humbled your heart, despite the fact that you knew all this. Just FYI, you've noticed he has not yet interpreted or read the writing on the wall. This is all introduction. He has not yet read those words. You have the audacity to lift yourself up over the lords of heaven. And the vessels of his house, they brought before you, and you and your concubines and your consorts are drinking wine out of the vessels of the temple, and at the same time, in the same breath, praising the gods of gold and silver and wood and stone, who cannot see, you cannot hear, who do not know. And that's who you give praise? Bet Elohim, asher nishmatcha biyado, l'chol drachecha lo, lo fe'arta, but God in whose hand your life breath is, and who all of your ways are his. Him you don't glorify, him you don't acknowledge. Azai mipanav nishlach pas shel yad. Therefore, from him was set forth this hand. Ktav zerashum. And this is what it says on the wall. Zektav ashirashum. Minei tekel ufarsin. Those are the 4 words that were written on the wall. And we will break them down and try to understand the meaning of the code, Bezrat Hashem, next week. The words are minei tekel ufarsin. And Daniel left nothing to chance. Ze pitaron hadavar. Now, you want to know what it means? I've read it for you. Now I'll tell you what it means. Minei manai elokim malchutcha v'izgira. God has counted, has numbered your days as king and ended them. Tekel, from the word mishkal, nishkalta b'moznayim v'nimtzeta chaser. You have been weighed on the balance and found wanting, lacking. Pres. Now, pres is also, these are Aramaic words. So pres has a dual meaning. Pres in Aramaic is pras, is half. Like, for those familiar with the phrase, kazayit b'chidei chilat pras, which is a certain amount of time. But it's also a play on the word pras, meaning Persia. So, nifrisa malchutcha v'nitna lemadai faras. Your kingdom has been divided, pras, and given over to Madai and Paras. My dear Belshazzar Melech Bavel, your days are over. Your kingdom will fall to Madai and Paras. Now, what did Belshazzar promise whoever interpreted the words, read the words and interpreted them? Honor, gifts, glory. What did Daniel say he could do with those gifts? Give them to whoever you want. I don't want them. Finishes reading this very uplifting forward script and inspiring words to Belshazzar. Azai tziva Belshazzar v'ilbishot Daniel argaman v'rabit shel zahav al tzavaro v'yichrizu alav sheyeh sholet shlishi b'malchut. So immediately Belshazzar proclaims that all of this should be given to Daniel, the gold and the purple robes and the gold chain and the position of third in his kingdom. Give it all to Daniel. I suspect that he gave it all to Daniel not because he deserved it and he interpreted the words correctly, but he probably felt that if he at least rewarded Daniel, maybe that would in some way appease Daniel or appease Daniel's God or appease some way and avert the calamity that Daniel has just predicted. Didn't help him very much because Bo Balayla Umat Belshazzar HaMelech HaKazdi. That night, Belshazzar met his end. That night, Belshazzar dies, and the end of the Babylonian era and kingdom falls to Persia, Paras, Umadai. That's the writing on the wall. That's the story of Belshazzar's feast. Next week, we'll talk about the actual code. I'll show you a very famous picture of artwork about Belshazzar's feast. There's a lot to unpack. But I want to come back to the question of the description of this feast. So first of all, let's start with the question of Daniel's attitude to Belshazzar. Compared to how Daniel has spoken over the years to Nebuchadnezzar, he sensed the tone change. He sensed the fact that he has very little patience for Belshazzar. He has very little respect for Belshazzar. Belshazzar, to his mind, is simply a mechanism and a vehicle for this nevuah, this prophecy. The handwriting is on the wall, which is where the expression comes from. Menei menei tekelu fasin, your days are numbered, you've been weighed and found wanting, your days are over, your kingdom falls to Persia. That's the message. And that's all he has to say to Belshazzar, other than the little history lesson about how he got from the great Nebuchadnezzar and the lessons of humility that God taught Nebuchadnezzar to the very small and very arrogant and very insignificant Belshazzar. So it's fascinating to me to see this contrast between the two. But there are two pieces of the story that we need to recognize right away. Number one, if you were to describe the character of Belshazzar, and remember, this is the only chapter we have to describe Belshazzar. We don't have any other stories of him in Tanakh. Sorry, I jumped past the beginning of the parak. I'm just scrolling back. We don't have any other stories of him in Tanakh. We don't have, like we have in Malachim and in Yirmiyahu and in Devarim, whole pieces of the story of Nebuchadnezzar and Nebuzaradan and others. We have this story of Belshazzar. So so what's the profile? Put together a profile of King Belshazzar of Bavel based on at least what we have here. We'll add to it. But based on what we have here, what can you tell me about Belshazzar? Briefly. Somebody pipe
Likes to drink.
Likes to drink. That's about it.
Loves to party.
Good time.
Loves to party, loves to drink. And
he reminds me of Achashverosh.
He
Very
reminds us
similar.
of Achashverosh. That's a very powerful observation because it's backwards. The reason it's backwards is because, and we'll see this in a moment, is to Chazal, it was exactly the opposite. Achashverosh reminded Chazal of Belshazzar. But we're less familiar with Belshazzar. Well, we're less familiar with Belshazzar, and so we are more familiar with Achashverosh, at least the midrashic picture of Achashverosh, which is built on the model of Belshazzar, not the other way around.
It sounds like
getting the description a lot like the feast in the beginning of Megillat Esther.
So we'll come to that comparison in a second.
It sounds like he feels very entitled to power, and he feels very secure.
He's very secure. He's very arrogant. But essentially, this feast is really all we have about him. And it essentially identifies two pieces of the story. Number one, that he certainly stooped in the pagan idolatries of the time. Number two, actually three pieces of information. Number two, that he loves to drink and party. That's all we know about him. And number three, that in his arrogance, he takes a very public position of shaming and of a bizoyan. I don't know how to bizui to
Contempt.
disgrace the very sanctity of the temple vessels that remain in Bavel. In other words, something which Nebuchadnezzar, at least the way Nebuchadnezzar is described in Tanakh, would never have done. Because even though he destroyed the temple and even though he exiled the people, but he had enough respect for the power of the temple to regard it with a certain amount of dignity, almost like two warring generals, kaviyachol, right? Two warring generals of stature and of power. And when one is victorious, he recognizes that he's victorious over somebody of stature and significance. Okay?
He puts the vessels into his temple, Nebuchadnezzar.
Correct.
It's very important to realize that. He doesn't take them for his treasury. He takes them and puts them into the temple treasury of his lady, of Ishtar. And that's where they are put. Because his God won over the Jews' God.
Correct. But to Nebuchadnezzar, that's correct. And that's Nebuchadnezzar's perspective on the world. Belshazzar takes them and drinks out of them, takes them and brings them into the feast, takes them and brings them into the I can describe the extraordinary sense of Chilul Hashem that is the underpinning of this story. Now,
but in defense of Belshazzar, you could say it's 40 years later, and frankly, Nebuchadnezzar conquered the temple, so he had respect for it. So 40 years later, or however number of years later it is, it's not as significant. People have forgotten what happened that long ago.
Maybe I hear you, but it still doesn't defend him. It just means that it's like okay, 3 generations later they have they have lost that sense of respect. But I certainly wouldn't.
He doesn't have respect for his own temple. He takes them out of his own temple.
Let me just take
uses them to party.
I appreciate everybody's comment. I want to kind of contain it for a second, and let's move to the next piece of the story, which is that so essentially when Daniel enters into the conversation, Daniel sees right away the context in which he's facing Belshazzar, the feast, the vessels of the temple, and the writing on the wall, puts it all together, and he knows exactly where this is going to go. I would add to it one additional piece, which is the fact, and we haven't learned them yet, but the previous 2 chapters, meaning not textually, but chronologically, are the 2 prophecies that Daniel has had, or 2 visions at the beginning of the reign of Belshazzar. Chapters 6 and 7 are the beginning of the reign of Belshazzar. And the beginning of the reign of Belshazzar, chapters 7 and 8. Bishnat Chada LeBelshazzar, Daniel has this vision, and these visions, chapters 7 and 8, are a description of the fall of Babel. So Daniel knows in his own relationship with God that Babel has now come to an end, and he sees this handwriting on the wall. Now, Chazal did something fascinating here, and Chazal saw the link between Belshazzar's feasting out of the vessels of the temple, and the fact that night he dies, and Daniel's message to him, and puts the 3 pieces together from the perspective of the story of Jewish history. Meaning, and with this, we're going to jump to the source page.
Excuse me for a second, Rabbi Shulman.
Yep.
Can I just ask something? V'hashkot b'klei zahav.
Wait, we'll get Esther. We'll get to Esther in a second.
I know,
Remember,
but he did drink.
In Esther, it's a medrash. In Esther, it's a medrash. It's not in the text. We'll get to medrash. We'll get to the story of Esther in a second. V'hashkot b'klei zahav v'kelim v'kelim shonim is in Esther.
And they say that's why you read the
I know what they say. I'll get to it. Hang on.
Okay.
Let me get to everything in due time. I know exactly what they say.
Thanks.
And the medrash that is associated with it, but I want to start with the fact that, this goes back to something we learned in our medrash class. Chazal introduce it into one place because they saw it in the text somewhere else. It's very important to realize which came first, the chicken or the egg. Belshazzar is first. Belshazzar is drinking out of the temple vessels. That's in the text. All Chazal did was look at the feast of Achashverosh and say, oh, this reminds me of the feast of Belshazzar.
But wasn't this also roughly like Samson?
Wait.
Samson, who was abused by the Plishtim in their temple while they're feasting, and he brings the temple down around them. So you could look at that parallel too. I would agree there's something to be developed there too. In this particular case, there's a much more direct connection. And that's the prophecy of 70 years. At the unspoken conversation in all of this is the fact that Yirmiyahu has predicted the fall of Babel after 70 years. We looked at those prophecies. Yirmiyahu has explicitly predicted in several passages that Babel will fall after 70 years. The only question is how to calculate those 70 years. Where does it start from? Does it start from the destruction of the temple, or does it start from the rise of Nebuchadnezzar? Where do you start from the calculation? But that's exactly what happens. The Gemara Megillah sees at the center of all of this a conversation about what's not written, which is, where is Yirmiyahu's Nevuah about 70 years?
And so the Gemara states the following with regards to Esther. Remember, the Medrash flips it. The Medrash is talking about Esther. We are going to go back to Belshazzar. The Medrash says, here's the psukim in Esther, very similar kind of feast. Esther, Achashverosh is having a big feast, 180 days, Chel Parasu Madai, for all of the warriors and soldiers of Parasu Madai and all of the officers, etc. 180 days, feasting with wine, Ve'ashkot b'chlei zahav, drinking out of gold vessels, the kelim mikelim shonim. Now, translated correctly, the kelim mikelim shonim means vessels of various kinds. Various kinds of vessels, and wine unlimited. V'yein malchut rav ki adama. But Chazal pick up on the word shonim and play it off the word yeshanim, old. Okay, that's the Medrash. What does the Gemara Megillah actually say? It says the following. On the one hand, it says Achashverosh's feast was when he sat on the throne. On the other hand, it's in his third year. What does that mean? It means Shinit Yeshvad Da'ato, that when Achashverosh became settled in. Achashverosh had this peace when he became settled in. Meaning, and now the Gemara is telling me what Achashverosh is thinking. Achashverosh is thinking, Belshazzar chesed v'ta'ah. The Belshazzar, when he made his big feast and took out the vessels of the temple, he made an incorrect calculation. But I will make the calculation correctly. Ana chashivna v'lo ta'ina. What are we talking about? Says the Gemara. The pasuk says, that God will redeem Israel when there is 70 years of prophecy concluded. And then it says, end of year of Daniel talks about the 70 years of the desolation of Yerushalayim. Chashev, so go calculate it. 45 years of Nebuchadnezzar, 23 years of Avil Medudach, 2 years, because this is the third year Belshazzar, so 2 previous years of Belshazzar, put it all together, you get 70. So Belshazzar is looking at the calculation, 70 years has come and gone, the Jews are still in exile. So now clearly the Jews are no longer going to be redeemed. Their dream of redemption is over. 7 years have come and gone. So he took the vessels out of the temple. But Achashverosh says, he made a mistake. What was the mistake? Whatever the mistake was, he calculated from the time that from Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's beginning of his reign, he didn't calculate from correctly. He was off by a couple of years. Says Achashverosh, I'll make the calculation correctly. Daniel turns to Belshazzar and says to him, I'll come back to Esther in a second. Daniel turns to Belshazzar and says to him, you have the audacity to arrogantly lift yourself up against God and to bring the vessels of his temple before you. That night Belshazzar died. And very important for us. Next pasuk, beginning of chapter 6. The Mede receives the kingdom. And this is the transition between Bavel and Persia. There's a few different midrashim about this story in Esther Rabbah and in the Gemara, and of course Chazal play it on Achashverosh as well. The kelim shonim. What does that mean? The first one's Belshazzar was destroyed because he used the vessels of the temple. You're going to repeat that same mistake. And so when you listen to the Megillah in 4 weeks' time, or 3 weeks' time, you will hear them read the words V'kelim shonim in the tune of Eicha. That minhag starts because Chazal took the story of Achashverosh and saw the background in Achashverosh's feast, the background of Belshazzar's feast. But understand which came first. Very important. Belshazzar is feasting out of the temple vessels. So Chazal, so let's forget Esther for a second. Let's leave it aside, because not our issue for today. Our issue for today is to understand what is it about this feast that so angered God that he responds with this writing on the wall, and so angered Daniel that he said to him, your days are over, and that night Belshazzar dies. So the truth is, I want to take the question one step back and ask the question as follows. let's assume for the moment you were Belshazzar, and let's assume for the moment there was this prophecy about 70 years coming and going. When is those 70 years up? On the anniversary date of the 9th of Av, 70 years later? Or the 10th of Av? Or the month of Av? Or the season of Av? What do you mean 70 years have come and gone? Events in history today take place in a day. You can change all of the course of human history today in a day. Unlikely to do so in the world of Tanakh. Events in Tanakh take time. They take process. So to suggest that Belshazzar looked at the calendar and said, oh, today is the anniversary of 70 years of Yirmiyahu's prophecy. It's not going to happen again. Clearly it's over. And therefore, what? And therefore he's going to bring out the vessels. Like, what day are we talking about? Things take place in historical process, not in a day. So what I wanted to suggest, and it's not my suggestions, based on both historical sources and Mefarshim, is that Belshazzar's feast is not about the celebration of the 70 years of Nebuchadnezzar, of the temple destruction directly. Indirectly, but not directly. What is he really celebrating? So take a look at the language here for a second. Who is he called and invited to this feast? Belshazzar Melech avad lechem rav, he made a great feast. L'rav Rivenohi alaf, for his great 1,000 officers, 1,000 ministers. The Elef Sarav. Who are his 1,000 ministers? The last feast to be described as 1,000 ministers in Achashverosh's feast, it says that he was brought 180 days, L'chol Sarav Avadav Chel Parasu Madai. Nobles and governors, officers of Parasu Madai. What is 1,000 sarim? So here's what the Malbim says. Belshazzar Melech asas suda gdola le'elef sarav, made a great feast, 1,000 officers. Sorry, I don't have a translation of this. I'm going to have to translate this for you on the fly. Uleneged elef shatayayin. According to Chazal, they knew 70 years prophecy from Babel, from Yirmiyahu. And therefore they calculated the time that it would be over and the Jews would remain in exile. Okay. Bishagam, now listen to this. Lema shesiper b'Yosifun. Now Yosifun is, some suggest it's Josephus. There's actually another reference in the Rishonim to Yosifun, which was a different commentary, Egyptian historian, not an issue for now, who Yosifun is, but it is told in Yosifun, Shelacham az b'madayu paras, that Belshazzar was in the middle of a war with Madayu Paras, Sha'alu alav l'milchama, that who came to war against him. The ha'elef sarim shalo, these 1,000 officers are his warriors, are his army. Anitzchut milchama, there are his upper echelons of his officers and soldiers and army and captains and chain of command, and they're celebrating. What do you think they're celebrating? They're celebrating what they think is their victory. And who's the victory against? Madayu Paras. They're celebrating their victory against Madayu Paras, against Persia, meaning there was a moment in the war where they thought they were going to win this war. And it could very well be that their army was being victorious. It was a long, protracted war. But you understand that if all the prophecies of Yirmiyahu and of Daniel, and of the early dreams of Nebuchadnezzar, all said that Babel would fall to Persia. Well, here's the war. It's happening. They're in the middle of it. Persia is knocking at the door. They're fighting the battle on the battlefront. But his soldiers come and report to him a major victory. We are victorious over Persia. We're done. And if that's true, then Babel remains forever, and Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a golden kingdom that will last for all eternity is fulfilled, and Yirmiyahu's prophecy is over, and all the prophecy of the redemption of Israel is over, because the redemption of Israel is tied to the fall of Babel. We're not falling. We're standing forever. That's a sign that his mazel, his constellation, his star, his angel is still in its strength, vitality. He thought that his star and his idolatry would be victorious over God. So he made a military feast to celebrate his victory. We're not learning Megillat Esther now, but at some point, Bezat Hashem, we'll learn Megillat Esther. Park in your minds that I think this exact same phenomenon interpretation can be given to Achashverosh's feast at the beginning of Megillat Esther. A military celebration, a military conclave. In Achashverosh's case, it's about the conquest of Greece. Here, it's about the conquest against, or the war against Persia. And that's why he brings out the kelim of the Beit HaMikdash, because the God of Israel is dead. The God of Israel is connected to the prophecies of the fall of Babel. Babel is not falling. Persia is falling. Babel is victorious. Now, interestingly enough, just to show you the context, Yirmiyahu in Perek Nun talks about a time when Babel will finally fall. Nilkadab Bavel, Hovish Bel, the god of I think it's Saturn. You said, right? The god, the deity of Babel. Chatam Merodach. Merodach is another one of the gods. All of their gods are trembling because Babel has fallen. And by Yamim Hahem, at that time, and this is what will happen. Israel will come and they will see God and they will return to Zion, Sion Yishalu. All focused on the fall of Babel. If Babel doesn't fall, Persia lasts forever. This war between Belshazzar and Medayu Paras is actually described in Josephus. Now, after the death of Nebuchadnezzar, Abimelech's son succeeded in the kingdom. This I'm reading from Josephus' Book of Antiquities. Again, Josephus has to be taken with a grain of salt, but that's for our purposes sufficient for now to understand the context. We immediately sat Yechoniah at liberty. That's based on the end of Sefer Malachim, and esteemed him amongst the most intimate friends. He also gave him many presents and made him honorable above the rest of the kings that were in Babylon. And we're going to skip to Avil-Merodach to where he dies. Avil-Merodach was dead after a reign of 18 years. Nigal-Shaletzar, his son, took over the government, retained it for 40 years, then ended his life. And after him, the succession in the king came to his son, I can't pronounce these names, who continued in it all but 9 months. And when he was dead, it came to Belshazzar, who by the Babylonians was called Nebuchadnezzar. That's get the issue of identifying who is not for our issue for now. Against him did Cyrus, king of Persia, and Darius, king of Mede, make war. And when he was besieged in Babylon, there happened a wonderful and prodigious vision. He was sat at upper supper at the large room, and there were a great many vessels of silver, such as were made for royal entertainments. And he had with him his concubines and friends, whereupon he came to a resolution and commanded that the vessels of God and the Nebuchadnezzar plundered out of Jerusalem and not made use of be put into, and had put them into his own temple. They should be brought out of the temple. And he grew so haughty as to proceed to use them in the midst of the cups of drinking wine and blaspheming against God. And the rest, as they say, is written on the walls. In other words, even Josephus links, and there's a lot of details here that are missing, a lot of details here that we don't have, but he links this feast with the war against Persia. Now, what happened in that war? They're celebrating victory. They're celebrating victory. What happened to suddenly that night Belshazzar dies? Well, answer is very simple. It doesn't tell us how he died. Just jumping to the end of the paragraph for a second. Doesn't tell us how he died. I'm going to make a huge conjecture. Is it possible that he was assassinated on his bed in his bedchamber that night, in his while he slept? What happens if you kill the king in the midst of war? And what happens if you kill the king? War's over. War's been won. Kingdom's gone. Whether it was a spy, whether it was a member of his own kingdom, it doesn't matter. We don't know. And therefore, Dayavash Hamadi takes over. And we shift in between Parak Hey and Parak Vav, between the world of Bavel and the world of Parasumadai. Now, I'm going to stop sharing for a second, and with this, we're going to conclude the shir because I have to answer last week's question. 50 years Daniel is missing. Suddenly he enters back into the conversation because he has a mission. 50 years ago, his mission was to teach Nebuchadnezzar humility before God. That was his mission. He was brought into the palace to teach, and Nebuchadnezzar accepted the mission, accepted his words. Nebuchadnezzar had great respect for Nebuchadnezzar and the message of Nebuchadnezzar. He's done. His mission has been accomplished. His role, his task is finished. And for all intents and purposes, we would not necessarily hear from Daniel again, except that now he has a new mission. And he's called back into service to deliver a single message. And the single message is the fulfillment of all of those prophecies Daniel had at the beginning of the book, which is the fall of Bavel to the hands of Persia. Belshazzar, in his arrogance, in his desecration of the temple, in his arrogance towards his people, in his war against Persia, in his attempt, everything about Belshazzar is the effort to undermine that very message. In walks Daniel. 50 years he's been missing. And he walks into the Belshazzar as if it was yesterday. And he says to him, Belshazzar, I told your father this was going to happen, your grandfather. The audacity, the chutzpah, the arrogance to take the vessels of the temple and to drink with them, your kingdom is over. Daniel's role here is to tell him, tonight you are in the grave. Tonight you will lie with your fathers. Tonight you can join Nevil Merodach and Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar. That's Daniel's role. Because Daniel essentially has two anchor points. The early chapters to Nebuchadnezzar and the latter chapters, which are to accompany the process of the fall of Bavel and its consequences for Israel. We will see the remaining parts of Sefer Daniel are all about Daniel's own visions and his own prophecies and his own prayers to defend Israel and to begin the redemption process. Daniel will become critical in reframing for the Jewish people, for the community of Israel, of Bavel, and for us, what it means to be redeemed, what it means to come out of exile. That's precisely why he walks back into the scene 50 years later to tell Belshazzar, tonight you are in the grave. And to end the arrogance of that reign, whether it was Belshazzar or his son or his grandson, whoever it is, but the context of it in the language of Tanakh is Belshazzar. That war with Persia is now over. Persia falls, Bavel falls, and Persia begins to come back onto the scene, and that remains for the chapters ahead. So thank you very much for listening. I appreciate. Sorry for cutting off that conversation in the middle. We will, B'ezrat Hashem, continue next week with our discussion of the writing on the wall, what it meant, and why it was encoded or how it was encoded. And so that's also just a fun piece of the story. And so we will see you all, B'ezrat Hashem, next week.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you.
Totally a pleasure.
Thank you. Toda rabah.
Bevakasha.
Rabbi,